Your worth isn't tied to your fertility. You're not a failure. Your body is not a failure. Your body's not broken. This is very, very common, and this is not your fault, and it's not in your control. And two things can be true at once. You're allowed to have complex and conflicting emotions. You're allowed to feel grief and heartbreak over a path not maybe looking or going the way you thought it would, but also to be proud of how far you've come and all you've been able to overcome. And fertility is, the journey of trying to navigate infertility, if that's something you're trying to overcome, is not a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon.
Well, Dr. Lucky, Sekhon, welcome to From Vision to Creation. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're so grateful to have you here. You're someone who has truly changed the way people understand and talk about fertility, which I think is super important, especially nowadays. Not through fear or pressure, but through clarity, compassion, and science-based truth. And in a world where social media is throwing all kinds of information at us all the time, that is so essential because it's really difficult to understand what's true and what isn't. As a double board certified reproductive endocrinologist, an author, and someone who has personally experienced IVF, you bring a rare depth of both expertise and empathy to this work. Your ability to make complex emotional topics feel human, hopeful, and empowering is incredibly special. And we're really excited to explore your journey and the vision behind the Lucky Egg with you today.
I'm so excited to talk about it because I think in this busy life, you get caught up in the day-to-day, and sometimes it's nice to kind of sit back and think, how did I even get here in the first place?
And on that note, Dr. Lucky, I want to start all the way back at the beginning. What was your upbringing like growing up in Toronto, and what early experiences shaped your interest in science and medicine?
Yeah, so I actually was the first person out of my siblings to be born in Canada. My family originally started, my parents met in England in a small town, not like in London, and they got married at a very young age, started having kids at a pretty young age, like in their early 20s. And me and my siblings, there's four of us, we're all pretty spread out in age. My oldest sibling is like 10 years older than me, same parents. We spanned 17 years, the four of us. And they immigrated originally from India. That's where my parents are from. And they have high school level education. They were very scrappy, like many immigrants are, and started their own businesses and worked really, really hard to provide a great life for me and my siblings. And so, I have that lens in my upbringing in terms of just being, I always say I didn't inherit generational wealth. I inherited generational work ethic. And so I've always been a hard worker. My parents had an issue with when they had my brother. He's 8 years younger than me. He was born preterm at 25 weeks. And that was something that really shaped my life experience. I was only 8 years old. And from, the time of my childhood to early teens, I watched them navigate some really serious health issues that he had as a result of being born preterm. And I was always really interested to try to understand why that happened. My mom was closer to 40 when she had him. And there were a lot of unanswered questions. And I saw how she navigated her health journey and trying to get some answers, and how she advocated for him when he was in and out of the ICU. And so healthcare was always kind of top of mind in my household. And I do think that it gave me an early appreciation for how far science had come and the miracles that, doctors and clinical teams can accomplish. And I think that's why it was always kind of in me to gravitate towards science and medicine. I really wanted to be in the field of women's health just because I grew up in kind of a matriarchal household. I have two sisters I'm really close with. And I think that it was very empowering to me to learn about the fact that the fields of fertility medicine hasn't been around for that long. And there's been such cutting edge advancements in terms of, IVF only really being a thing as late as the 1970s. And we've gone from single digit success rates to being able to tell patients a lot of the time that they're pregnant, especially if they have, a healthy embryo to transfer. There are still obviously challenges, but I think that in combination with the empowerment of women and being able to offer options like egg freezing that my grandmother never had at her disposal, all of that was really appealing to me, and it led me very organically to fertility medicine.
And what was the exact moment during your training when you realized this specialty was where you could make the deepest impact?
Well, I think the earliest that my interest was piqued was when I was, even before med school, I did an internship at the Cleveland Clinic, and I was sitting in a room with mostly men talking about urology, andrology. It's like the study of male fertility, sperm. And it was just kind of like what I was assigned to be quite honest. And that's where I first learned about IVF and all of this amazing technology. I had no reason to know about it before then. And I was in my early 20s, right? But I think that was fascinating to me that, oh my gosh, like I'm the first generation to exist that could actually see success with something like egg freezing, which was viewed as experimental before 2013. So I'm talking about like early 2000s is when, I was making these discoveries and becoming really passionate about it. And then in the course of my training, I just kept coming back to it. I tried to keep an open mind because, I was very practical and always had been. I said to myself, there's so many other fields of medicine. Who knows? Maybe I'll find something else I'm really interested in. And I tried to explore other avenues, but I kept gravitating back towards women's health and knowing that ultimately the thing that got me really interested and passionate about medicine, besides those early life experiences, was understanding the translation of research and cutting edge advancements into actually helping people get pregnant and have options where they otherwise maybe wouldn't have had options. And that's what really led me down this path. I kept trying to get interested in other things, but I remained steadfast in what I was passionate about. And now, several years later, here I am, finding new ways within the field to get excited and to really try to push the needle forward. I think a big part of what I do online and in my book is advocacy and education, because I think the biggest problem in our field is the fertility knowledge gap.
Yes, I agree. And you just said something right now that really piqued my interest. What was it like studying a field that at one time was considered experimental and watching it legitimized throughout your career? What has that been like for you personally?
It's been really gratifying. I mean, I think it's amazing to be in any field where you're seeing such fast moving advancements. And I can say, even I'm not, very senior in my career. I'm not anywhere near retirement. I still have a lot of work that I want to do. But even in the time that I've been a clinician, a specialist in fertility, helping patients either, navigate fertility preservation for the future and planning out their future versus trying to overcome infertility now, I have seen major shifts in the technology, right? Like my mentors always told me, they would be surprised if someone was pregnant. And that's crazy to me because back then IVF was very viewed as experimental. People were paying out of pocket for just a chance at overcoming infertility and getting pregnant. There was definitely no guarantees. And certainly no insurances were covering fertility treatment, which is insane to me when you think about, not to get dramatic, it's the perpetuation of the human race, to help people overcome infertility. But it was very much kind of lumped in with plastic surgery, anything else that's viewed as elective, as an add-on, not essential care. And now we're seeing a shift even in that, in that ideology. At least half of the patients that come to me to freeze their eggs have insurance coverage. And 10 years ago, it was 0%, right? So seeing that shift in how society, how insurance companies, how policy views the need for fertility treatment and the need to provide access to not just overcoming infertility, but treatments to prevent infertility in the future, that's hugely inspiring to me. But even within the technology itself, it's become so much safer, way more effective. The complications that used to be commonplace in my field as a result of treatments like IVF, twins, and all of the things that come along with that, those high-risk pregnancies, which I'm particularly passionate about preventing, given my experience growing up with my brother and all the issues he had to face as a result of being preterm. Now we hardly ever put back multiple embryos at a time. We're able to offer really high success rates, and therefore there's no real justification to use more than one embryo at a time. So as a result, there's a lower chance of twins unless an embryo splits, which happens like 2% of the time. Most people are having one baby at one time, and that allows you to have a better chance of having a full-term delivery, a lower risk of complications, and even the protocols in how we get patients pregnant have become a lot safer with a lower risk of complications, all the while with improved success rates. So it's been a really wonderful time to be part of this field. I really look back at, if you watch the movie Joy, it was on Netflix recently. It did a great job of kind of detailing, all of the characters and experts that were involved in the advent of IVF. I really hand it to people that practiced 20 years ago or the people that pioneered the technology, because you have to have a lot of resilience and grit to keep doing something over and over and hoping for a different result. And, that type of progress takes time. And there's so many setbacks before you hit a breakthrough. And I get to enjoy the benefits of that now. I get to call so many of my patients and give them good news because of the hard work of other people and their not giving up on this dream of, pushing this technology and treatment option forward.
I didn't realize that people who have been going through IVF in the past, that twins was an accidental result of that. Can you
Yes.
explain to us how exactly that happens?
Right. So our bodies are designed, our reproductive system is designed to only ovulate one egg each cycle, ideally each month, right? And then people time their attempt around that. And the ideal situation is you have a bunch of eggs available, but only one gets selected to ovulate, and maybe it gets fertilized, maybe it turns into an embryo that then implants. Your uterus has a finite amount of space in it. And if an embryo splits, which can happen in nature about 1% of the time or less, it can happen with fertility treatments too, not just IVF, but sometimes we help people with irregular ovulation, or we help people that have unexplained infertility where we're just trying to boost their odds a little bit so they can take oral medications or even some injections that will lead them to ovulating or releasing more than one egg. So that's one way that twins can happen, is you release too many eggs and it's hard to gauge which ones will actually get to the finish line and turn into a baby. And so sometimes about a 3 to 8% chance of having twins, especially with oral medications used to induce or boost your ovulation. IVF is different. It's taking the process outside the body. You're taking shots. You're trying to get as many of the eggs that are available, not just the one your body would normally select on its own randomly. It's not based on merit. And you're trying to get all of them to grow and then be extracted in a procedure. And it takes about 2 weeks to get to that point. Then you're taking multiple eggs and you're putting them with sperm and you're growing them into embryos. But not every egg will get there because human reproduction is inefficient. And maybe only half of the eggs that we try to fertilize will even grow into embryos. And a good proportion of those embryos are going to be unhealthy and have errors in them because human reproduction is inefficient. And so we can test embryos now. We can freeze them and we can use one at a time. But back in the day, I'm talking like 20 years ago, we weren't very good at freezing embryos. And we didn't even have the technology to test the embryos. So you were kind of hedging your bets saying, all right, this person is paying out of pocket for this expensive experimental treatment, and I want to give them the best chance possible. So I might put back 4 embryos or 5 embryos. Like, let's just, whatever we have in our hands, like, let's use it and try to use it, because if we don't use it, we lose it. Whereas now, when we freeze and thaw embryos, 97 to 98% will survive the thawing process, and it doesn't seem to impact its ability to implant. And you're able to test embryos. So now we've gotten a lot better at being able to choose the best embryo that has the best chance of success, like a 60 to 70% chance of live birth. And we can just put one at a time, because putting in more than one at a time, you're certainly going to overshoot the goal a lot, and you're going to have a much higher risk of twins. Twins increase your risk of preterm delivery by 6 times. And every complication you can think of that you're trying to avoid when pregnant is heightened with twin pregnancies for both mom and the babies. So it's really important to try to minimize those risks. And because we've gotten so good at IVF, And within 3 consecutive embryo transfers of a single embryo, you can say 92% cumulative live birth rate. That's a lot of people that do get pregnant. And obviously there are outliers and people that have difficult journeys, but we've gotten a lot better at it. And therefore we can be more conservative and take on less risks, which is fantastic.
And so just to clarify then, there was an error in my question because you're not more at risk of twins going through IVF. You were referencing other fertility treatments.
Yes.
Got it.
I mean, there's a slightly increased risk. I said naturally, when you ovulate one egg that turns into an embryo, it could split like 1% of the time. With IVF, and it may be due to the lab environment or increased handling, there's a slight uptick in that. It's just above 2%. So overall, the risk is still low if you're transferring one embryo at a time, but there might be a slight increase above if you were just ovulating and trying to get pregnant on your own.
And Dr. Lucky, you're now a double board certified reproductive endocrinologist. And I don't think everybody really realizes how long and how difficult that is. Can you explain to people about the journey? And the reason I ask is that, like we were mentioning earlier, there's a lot of misinformation out there on social media. So I think it's really important that everybody knows who their information is coming from.
Yes, absolutely. So, you do your college or undergraduate degree, and then you go on to medical school, which is typically 4 years. And then from medical school, you do general OBGYN training. And what that is, you're a resident. And that basically, that term comes from the fact that you essentially feel like you live in the hospital. You work, 80 to 100 hours a week. You're learning everything from delivering babies to how to take care of complex gynecologic cancers. You're learning how to do all the different types of surgeries. You are becoming a true expert through and through in all things women's health. And then you decide, do I want to kind of do this generally and take care of patients who I'm helping them through their pregnancy? I'm helping them, I'm doing their pap smears and doing their general checkups. Or do I want to be a specialist? And so I knew I wanted to be a specialist from day one of even residency. Kept an open mind to all the different fields, but ultimately kept gravitating towards fertility medicine. I just thought the science was so interesting and it's very empowering and inspiring. So then I did 3 additional years of subspecialty training. And it's like getting a mini master's or PhD in that 18 months of it was hardcore scientific research. My project specifically was looking at the question of why do some embryos stop growing, in the lab? Because it takes a lot of eggs, even with IVF, and how far we've come to make healthy embryos. And so I collected, with permission from couples going through infertility who were going through IVF, any of their arrested embryos, and I sequenced them and looked at very deeply like gene expression and things like that. The other half of it is clinical, and you're learning how to navigate stimulating someone's ovaries, how to overcome different forms of infertility, all of the cutting edge tests, and things that one would need to know. And so it's really comprehensive subspecialty training that you should be able to tackle anything that comes your way when it comes to fertility issues or even trying to help prevent fertility issues moving forward.
And Dr. Lucky, when did you first recognize how much misinformation surrounds fertility, even among highly educated patients?
I mean, every day of my job, every single day that I speak to patients, it's a reminder to me of how little we are equipped, entering our 20s and our 30s with formalized education and knowledge. That's why I'm calling my book Health Class 2.0. Because let's be honest, health class happens very early in your life. It's very bewildering. It's awkward. You're at a point in your life where the goals are very different than what they might be as you enter your 20s and 30s and beyond. And it's all about preventing pregnancy. And you're also almost led to believe there is this narrative that you can get pregnant so easily. When we know in reality, when you're in your reproductive prime years in your 20s, at maximum, we can say there's a 20 to 25% chance when you ovulate that egg could actually result in a pregnancy. Now, of course, you don't want to tell a room full of horny teenagers that actually there's only like a few days within the cycle where it makes sense that you could get pregnant, and it's not as easy as one might think, because obviously there's an importance to avoiding unplanned pregnancies. But I think beyond contraception and avoiding an unplanned pregnancy, which is very important information for young people to have, my hope behind writing my book and all the education I'm providing online is that I don't want patients to come to me only when they have a problem, and at that point I'm filling in these knowledge gaps, because it's already then they're at a stressful point, right? Where they're thinking their body's broken and something's wrong with them. And it's so much harder to learn and retain important information and make wise decisions along the way if you're not equipped with that knowledge from the get-go. So I think it's really critical for everyone to understand how their reproductive system works. I'm talking to very accomplished, educated people every day that are in their 40s even, and they're like, I just realized I truly don't know what ovulation means. And I thought that I ovulated from one ovary 1 month and then the next it alternated. And I'm like, no, that's not how it works. When people realize the inefficiency and the randomness of human reproduction, and also when they stop normalizing things like painful periods, heavy periods, symptoms that often can lead you to a path of diagnosing a major gynecologic issue that could have an impact on their fertility, it opens their eyes and they're thinking, why didn't anyone tell me this? And so I do think too much is left up to chance in hoping you have the right gynecologist that educates you on these matters, or hoping you stumble upon the right information online or have a friend group that's talking openly about this. And I do think that we need to do more to ensure that everyone's on a level playing field and that we close that fertility knowledge gap.
I think there's a difference too between somebody who is educating themselves with the resources available and somebody like yourself who is quite literally on the front lines of this research. And I'm very excited for your book, and I'm glad you put this together, because I know especially nowadays this is a very important topic because more and more people are going through it. And so having something like this is going to be groundbreaking, and I'm just very excited.
Me too. I think it's going to change a lot of people's lives. I'm looking forward to the day where someone comes to see me and says, I've read your book and I have all of this baseline knowledge, and now let's have this elevated conversation. I think that's going to be really gratifying.
That's exactly right. It's like once you have a baseline knowledge about anything, you can ask the bigger questions and start to think about more about how it applies to you and how you can implement that in your life. It's so true. And Dr. Lucky, another thing that makes you uniquely qualified in this field is that you've been open about the fact that you've been through secondary IVF yourself. How did becoming a patient after years of being a doctor change the way you view fertility treatment?
Yeah, so my story is that knowing all the advice I give my patients and counseling about the biological clock and what it means for women, at 34, I had already had my first child, and that was such a special moment in my life. But it was also really a challenge for me to navigate, and it's a challenge for so many women to navigate their growing, progressing career, but also wanting to have it all and wanting to have, a healthy relationship and to start building their family. And for me, I had made the decision to start trying before I knew that everything was perfect and aligned and ready. I was still actually in training when I had my first. And then I very quickly realized, oh my gosh, this is very overwhelming. And even though I know I want a larger family, I may want 3 children, I'm not equipped to do this again anytime soon. And it made me anxious. I also had, a low egg count, which doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem, but to me that was a red flag, and I wanted to be proactive, just like I urge my patients to be proactive. So my husband and I did embryo freezing. That was a path that proved unpredictable. I was a bit cocky going into it. I said, okay, yeah, I know my numbers, and I intellectualized everything. But going from everything on paper to actually doing, the shots day in, day out, having the procedure, getting the updates of how many eggs I had, how many actually fertilized, how many made it to embryos, that was really something that blindsided me, because I didn't really anticipate realistically how it felt to be the patient in that moment. And I thought knowing everything and understanding the whys and the ins and outs would protect me from those emotions, but it did not. I had a cycle where my doctor, who's a great colleague of mine, I did my cycle where I work, because obviously I knew that it's a great program and has a great lab. And at least I had all of that confidence, which helped me. But even despite the confidence and the knowledge and the know-how, it was hard to get a call that, okay, your response isn't as good as we hoped it was, and probably it doesn't make sense to move forward with the egg retrieval. And then in the second cycle where I got, 2 eggs at retrieval and nothing to show for it, none of them turned into embryos. Those are moments in time that I refer back to and remember and draw upon when I was writing this book and talking about the mental health challenges. Because if someone in the know, could feel blindsided and struggle, with the mental health aspects of all of the twists and turns of fertility treatment, how does someone who's a layperson deal, right? And I think that that's often the thing that's most underestimated is the mental health impact that all of this can have on a person. And I think that's what I really, as a result of that experience, have started to emphasize even more. And it's why I wove mental health messaging throughout my book, not just at the end, just to say, okay, we addressed it. I really tried to address it in every single chapter because I think the mental health challenges and things to overcome and be aware of are very different for someone facing male infertility, like a low sperm count, or they don't make any sperm, right? Or someone with a low egg count, or someone who's navigating pregnancy loss. Each journey is so unique. And that was something that really, I think if I didn't go through that experience as a patient, I don't know if I would have put the same emphasis on mental health that I did in my book.
Were there moments during your own journey where your medical knowledge conflicted with your emotional experience? And if so, how did you navigate that dual perspective?
Yeah, I think that was the biggest takeaway, right? I felt shame and I felt guilt. I felt embarrassed, even though I know my colleagues and there was no reason to feel embarrassed. But I felt like I feel like I could have done better. I could have slept more during this time. I could have, eaten healthier. All the things that my patients talk to me about that I am constantly addressing and saying, this is not your fault. This is not in your control. Those same thoughts occurred to me. And even though I knew better, it didn't change the fact that those thoughts came to mind and I had to actively suppress them. I had to actively address them and ask myself, why am I going to this place mentally? Because I know that this is not the advice or information I would give my patients. But at the end of the day, even doctors with all the expertise and know-how, when they're patients, they're patients. And that's a really important life lesson.
And I know that you've always seen how important it is for this information to be out there, for everyone to have access to this. But at what moment did you realize that your new book, The Lucky Egg, needed to exist?
Well, it was kind of an organic journey. It wasn't like one light bulb moment. I think I was kind of waiting around as a clinician, having these conversations with bewildered patients who are clearly suffering from that knowledge gap and feeling like they don't have formalized guidance. And basically, giving them a biology 101 lesson each consult. I'm spending a full hour with every patient. And then I'm doing my social media and outreach, that I started becoming a lot more prolific with that as of 2020. And I saw the impact that was positive from that I was making an impact beyond the four walls of my clinic. I was able to help more than just my own patients, but also my own patients were coming in calmer and more in control because they're like, oh, I watched that video or I read your blog. But one thing that I grew weary of was how fragmented that experience can be. The number of DMs I get per day, you wouldn't even believe. People saying, oh, do you have a post on this? Do you have a post on that? The grid doesn't lend itself well to a search. And I decided, we need a book that's comprehensive, that's written by an expert, that has an index, and that is written in a way that has foundational knowledge and then builds to become more complex and addresses not just the physical, but the mental health aspects. And I kept waiting around for someone else to do it, to be honest with you. And it just didn't exist. And I said to myself, it's 2024, 2023. How does this not exist yet? Every book that's popular is not written by an actual fertility expert, and it's not nearly as comprehensive as the resource that I think we all need to have. And so eventually an opportunity presented itself, and I said, I guess, I felt like this book wasn't something I set out to write. It demanded to be written, and it was really like a natural, organic process and path that led me to it.
And Dr. Lucky, you frame the book as if a best friend also happens to be a top fertility expert, which I think is great. But why was it important for you to use warmth, humor, and real patient stories rather than a traditional clinical tone?
Well, when you think about, the things that make people apprehensive, the reasons why people might delay going to the doctor, I've seen patients walk in, and often it's people that don't even know I have an online presence, where they walk in and you can see they're visibly shaking. They're so nervous about this conversation and what I might tell them. And the patients who do follow me online and already have an introduction to who I am, my ethos, the types of things that I talk about, they come in much more reassured and calmer. And that alone for me is the reason why I strike the tone that I do. I think everyone wants to feel less alone. Everyone wants or wishes they had a friend that was in the know that could come with them and accompany them. And this can be a very lonely experience. Even if you're partnered and in a couple going through it, everyone has their own way of coping, and it can put a strain on relationships. And I think everyone just wants to know that they're doing the right thing. That's why they're on Google till 2 a.m., in forums, sharing and gathering information. But that's not always going to be the right information. And so that's why I framed it that way. It's like, you want to be able to cut through the noise. You want to feel like you have a trusted person in your corner. And you don't want to use medical jargon or make it so overly clinical. White coat hypertension, that is a real thing. It's a real biological phenomenon where people who don't normally have high blood pressure all of a sudden get high blood pressure and get stressed and nervous when they see a white coat. It's why I don't wear a white coat. I leave it hanging on the back of my chair. I really strive to do anything and everything I can to disarm patients, because when people are nervous and fearful and anxious, they're not retaining information. And so much of this is like learning a new language and trying to close that knowledge gap so people can make really informed decisions and not waste their time.
Well, and you mentioned that it's a lonely process, which I find really interesting because 1 in 6 people experience infertility, yet so many still feel alone and shame. What do you think has prevented open conversations around fertility for so long?
I think shame and self-blame. I think people are less likely to talk about something that makes them feel bad about themselves. They're more likely to kind of turn inward. And as a result, they get more and more isolated. And in addition, if they do choose to be vulnerable and start opening up to their circle, they may be met with things that aren't helpful, that people think are helpful, like unsolicited advice, statements like, oh, it's not meant to be, or it's God's plan, or why don't you just adopt? And that pushes them further into themselves, where they're not going to ever want to be vulnerable again. I'm seeing major progress, and I have to credit social media, online communities, because that was a really safe way for a lot of people to kind of dip their toe in the water of, I'm going to share, but I'm going to share kind of privately or anonymously because I'm going to create a fake Instagram account. So many people have fake Instagram accounts, by the way, so that they can talk about their fertility journey openly, but still not share their identity. And that, I think, has been hugely helpful to a lot of people, because the more people share, even if they're not showing what their identity is, they're a person, there are online communities, there's a whole subculture. And people call this, the worst club to be a part of, those who are facing infertility, with the best members. Because really and truly, people show up for each other in ways that their own family members sometimes can't show up for them. And there's a unique understanding between people going through this journey who have walked this journey, similar to the unique understanding I gained from being a patient. 2 different patients, they could be in 2 different states talking online, but they can provide more support to each other sometimes than their friends or family members can to them.
Are there any online communities that immediately come to mind that you think are some of the good ones that people should join if they're going through this?
Yes, there is a not-for-profit called Resolve. Their website is resolve.org. What I love about them is no matter where you're at in the country, you can look up these fertility support groups, whether it's online or in person. And guess what? If you're in an area where that doesn't exist yet, they actually give you a toolkit that gives you what you need to start one, which I think is fantastic. So it's very grassroots and all about helping people, feel less alone. And if they don't have a community, to create one.
I love that. I'm going to include the link to their website in the episode notes, so anybody who wants to check it out can easily do that by clicking below.
Amazing.
Dr. Lucky, you spend a lot of time debunking myths. What, in your opinion, I have two parts to this question. what is the most prevalent myth you find yourself debunking most often? And which one is the most shocking to you?
I think there's so many myths, it's hard for me to choose. I think one of the most shocking and prevalent myths, just to kind of two birds, one stone it, is the lack of acknowledgement of the impact of male fertility. It's 50-50, right? It takes sperm and egg to come together and form an embryo and eventual baby. And yet, a lot of people are shocked by the fact that 50% of couples with infertility will have a male factor. Now, there could be a combination of things, but I think people don't think it's that prevalent. And there is this idea of invincibility because men are always making new sperm throughout their lives and can get women pregnant at older ages, whereas we have a hard time getting pregnant and staying pregnant as we get older because of our biological clock, and we don't make new eggs and have repair mechanisms, that there's this unequal weight placed on female fertility. But it's a shame because male fertility should not be neglected because there's always an opportunity to improve it if there always is an ability to make more sperm. And so that's a huge one. Another big common misconception is this idea that your egg count defines your fertility, because now we have tests where people can actually test their AMH level, or they can get an ultrasound done. And I think that the interpretation of those results is too overreaching, and automatically people feel labeled. And I explain to them, everyone's on a level playing field. You're all ovulating one egg each time you ovulate each cycle. So unless you're going through fertility treatments, that's the only place where I really care about your egg count. Otherwise, this is not something that you should feel bad about or label yourself with, because we don't know everyone's egg count, right? We're only looking at yours because you decided to get it tested, and it doesn't always mean what you think it means. And that's a big thing that I talk about in the book.
And is there anything that people can do to prevent infertility, or is it kind of out of your hands?
I think there are things that you can do from a lifestyle perspective. You can avoid smoking because that's bad for male and female fertility. Heavy drinking is also bad for fertility, believe it or not. I think bad for your heart health tends to be bad for fertility. So that's kind of a way to simplify it. So drinking less than 4 drinks in a given week is kind of the guide that we give our patients. We know for a lot of reasons, alcohol consumption in excess is never a good idea. And then when it comes to your metabolic health, like being sedentary increases the risk of insulin resistance and infertility. Weight gain. So really trying to combat those through diet, exercise. And for some people, because they may be genetically wired a certain way, they may benefit, their fertility may benefit from the assistance of certain medications. Like I have patients on GLP-1 agonists or a drug called metformin to help them become more sensitive to the effect of insulin. And that in turn can really help them to ovulate more regularly, to have healthier eggs turn into healthier embryos, and to even lower their risk of miscarriage. So these are all things that are often surprising, but very simple solutions that we know are, common sense, good for your overall health, your heart health, and can also have a positive impact on fertility.
And you said that IVF is not a guarantee, but it does improve odds. How should people realistically think about success, attrition, and timelines when entering treatment?
Well, that's a great question, because I do think there is this misconception that, okay, I'm, maybe trying some laid back treatment options. Now we're going to bump up the level of aggressiveness and we're moving on to IVF, and this will be the automatic solve. And while the success rates have become really good in a lot of people who were unable to get there, whether they were trying on their own or doing lesser treatment options that are considered low tech, kind of not taking the process outside of the body, but maybe ovulating an extra egg, putting sperm at the top of the uterus. That's called medicated IUI. And those laid back treatments are associated with laid back success rates. But then when you move to the blockbuster fertility treatments, IVF, you're controlling a lot more of the aspects, right? You're stimulating the ovaries and extracting multiple eggs, and you're putting those eggs directly together with sperm, and you're cultivating them into embryos, you're testing the embryos, but you're still working within the confines of an inefficient reproductive system. So just because you're doing this really high-tech process, which can feel labor-intensive, it can be expensive, it doesn't automatically mean that inefficiency goes away, right? And so whatever number of eggs we're collecting, instead of you just ovulating 1 or maybe ovulating 2 or 3 if you're taking medications to kind of boost that process, you're hoping to be able to mature and extract multiple eggs And then it's survival of the fittest, and you're still going to have attrition in the lab where maybe only 70 to 80% of eggs will fertilize. Maybe only 60% of those that fertilize will turn into embryos. And not every embryo is guaranteed to be healthy. Even in our 20s, 20 to 25% of the embryos coming from our eggs might have missing or extra DNA. And these are embryos that won't result in a healthy pregnancy. So that can happen to anyone. And we're all kind of dealt the same hand when it comes to dealing with this inefficiency. Obviously, as we get older, it becomes less efficient because the ability of an egg to turn into a healthy embryo starts to change with our egg quality declining with age. And when it comes to IVF, we typically have access to fewer eggs because however many eggs come to the surface each month and are capable of being extracted by a fertility doctor like me, that is a function of your overall ovarian reserve, how many eggs you have. And so as we get older, IVF can become less successful and more challenging, and it may require multiple rounds of effort because you have access to fewer eggs and they have a lower conversion rate. So the way to think about IVF is it is much more efficient than just trying with one egg randomly being ovulated each cycle. And you're controlling a lot more of the process, but you're still going to face attrition. And that's why numbers can be helpful. The higher your egg count, the easier it can be to be successful with IVF. But it's not just about numbers. And I've had plenty of patients, especially younger patients in their 20s and early 30s, where they might be grappling with a low egg count and a harder time responding to the medications to get those eggs to mature and be extracted. But because of their young age, they have a really high conversion rate. So I've had patients get 3 eggs at egg retrieval and still get 1 or 2 normal embryos with a 60 to 70% chance of live birth each. So it really is an interplay between numbers and quality of the eggs. And also the quality of the sperm obviously plays a role as well. And that's why it is hard to predict and know ahead of time. Are you going to get there in the first cycle? Are you going to get what you need? Or will you be someone that needs to do it more than once? The first cycle of IVF that someone does is not just therapeutic. It's not just treatment. It can also be very much diagnostic because you're getting insight into reproductive biology that you didn't have prior to doing that process.
That's really interesting. And that it's actually piquing my interest about egg freezing because I know that's become really popular lately. How do you help patients understand both its power and its limitations?
Yes, I love that question, right? Because I think egg freezing is a wonderful thing. I've seen it help many of my patients extend their reproductive window. I've had patients freeze eggs with me in their late 20s all the way up until their late 30s, even sometimes their early 40s. And then they come back at an older age and they need IVF. And often it can be because their biological clock and the way things have changed with their egg quality, their ability to ovulate a healthy egg. But there could be many other reasons. Whatever the reason is, if they need to do IVF and we have eggs frozen from an earlier age, why wouldn't we dip into the supply of younger eggs? Because they're going to be more plentiful. From one round of effort, I likely would be able to get more eggs in the past than I will in the future because I have access to fewer. That's just a function of how our ovaries age. But more importantly, each of those eggs is thought to have a higher conversion rate when you go to turn them into embryos. So I never think about egg freezing as a backup plan or insurance policy because that implies it's a sure thing. You're still operating within the confines of an inefficient reproductive system, but it can give you a massive head start to say, hey, I'm going to start with a larger pool of my 35-year-old eggs at 38 versus then starting from scratch at 38 where I might have a lower conversion rate and start with less eggs. And it can make it more likely that IVF will be successful. Now, I've had patients where maybe the attrition was sharper than we thought, and we didn't get everything we wanted out of that first round. Because egg freezing, you're freezing potential, but only when you go to fertilize each egg and grow it into embryos will you know how many make it to the finish line. And so I've had patients where they use their frozen eggs, there's a sharper than expected or what we wanted to see attrition. And then they have the ability to go ahead and do another round if they need to. But it still gives them a head start versus if they didn't have those frozen eggs to work with at all.
For LGBTQ plus individuals and couples, fertility journeys can include additional legal, political, and logistical hurdles. What are some of the most overlooked challenges this community faces, and what advice would you give to an LGBTQ plus couple who's just about to embark on their IVF journey?
This is a really important one because often people are only fixated on the issues that they themselves have had to face or maybe a loved one. But when it comes to LGBTQ family building, I have a whole section of my book dedicated to this. And I've never seen that. I've never seen that in any fertility resource. But I really wanted this to be like a fertility Bible that was all encompassing. And no matter who you are, no matter whether you're doing this journey on your own or you're partnered, whether you and your partner lack a critical component, which is the case for a lot of LGBTQ individuals and couples, they need donor sperm. If it's a same-sex female couple, they have ovaries, they have two sets of uteruses, but they don't have sperm. And so from the get-go, they are relying on my expertise and they're relying on science to help them get there. And it doesn't have to be IVF for everyone. It could be just using donor sperm and injecting it into the uterus of the partner that wants to carry and doing that with the right timing, but giving realistic expectations of we're working within this framework. This may take 3 to 6 rounds. This is how much donor sperm you should purchase. Here's all the testing and screening we should do on you to help you choose the best donor that's going to lead to the best chance of having a healthy child. And trying to avoid certain problems before they can start. So doing genetic testing on a partner whose egg is going to be used and combined with a sperm. And, really making sure that we're protecting the patients and we're also making sure that we're minimizing the risk of major problems in a future child and helping them get there in a way that not only meets their current goal of getting maybe to baby number 1, but also what's the larger framework or goal? Do they want to have 2 children? Is it important for both of them to contribute an egg to each child? Who wants to carry? There's so many questions and it can become very confusing. It's great to have options and choices, but it can also be more about really helping a couple to narrow down what the plan should look like. But it requires resources. And oftentimes insurance plans make no sense. They'll say, well, you don't qualify for fertility treatment because you're not infertile. You haven't been trying. But how could you be trying if you lack a critical component required to try? And so those are a lot of the legal, debates and battles that are being fought. And often one, thankfully, where we're seeing better coverage and more inclusive care that is considering not just one type of patient or one type of couple, but also looking at all of the different ways that you can build a family and making sure that the definitions of infertility are inclusive of that. For same-sex male couples where they lack the eggs and they lack the ability to carry a pregnancy, then it's even more complicated. It can be very costly to navigate using an egg donor. And the only way to utilize an egg donor is through the process of IVF, right? You have to take the eggs out of someone's body and you have to fertilize them with sperm. And then you also need to go the route of a gestational carrier, or what a lot of people refer to as a surrogate, to help carry that pregnancy. And so it takes teamwork and it takes resources. And oftentimes there are gaps in the coverage. And I think that's the thing that surprises a lot of people that I wish more people were aware of, because it really makes it an unfair situation. And this is something I have so many of my patients who are navigating this, and I see such a variation in who gets access and who doesn't. And that's something that we really need to be focusing on.
And Dr. Lucky, as a doctor, author, mother, and advocate, what do you hope readers feel after finishing your book, The Lucky Egg?
I hope they feel calm, in control, informed, and more sure of their next step and what the path ahead will look like or could look like. I think the biggest source of stress is feeling that lack of control, feeling like there's a million different things in front of you and you just don't know how to navigate and wade through them all. There's so much noise that you referred to earlier on social media, especially, but even just being bombarded with online ads because you at one point searched how to track ovulation and now all of a sudden you're being targeted with all these ads for supplements. There's so much of what we don't need and so much noise that is not helpful and just adds to the stress of it all, that my hope is people can say, I'm not going to rely on any of that. I'm going to read this book. This is the Fertility Bible. This is giving me the foundational knowledge and then building in complexity depending on what's important to me in my journey, and that there's something for everyone. I hope, and I really feel confident in saying that I don't think there's any single individual who will read this and say, oh, this didn't really cover what I need. Because whether it's surrogacy, donor egg, or just getting started and not knowing how to even start tracking your ovulation or what you could be doing to optimize your health to put your best foot forward when it comes to fertility and getting pregnant, there's really something for everyone, but it starts with that foundational knowledge so that people, finish reading it and say, oh, it's not as complicated as I thought. And I feel like I can kind of tackle anything because now I have that foundational knowledge.
And if someone is listening right now who feels stuck, discouraged, or behind on their fertility journey, what do you most want them to hear?
I want them to know that your worth isn't tied to your fertility. You're not a failure. Your body is not a failure. Your body's not broken. This is very, very common, and this is not your fault, and it's not in your control. And two things can be true at once. You're allowed to have complex and conflicting emotions. You're allowed to feel grief and heartbreak over a path not maybe looking or going the way you thought it would, but also to be proud of how far you've come and all you've been able to overcome. And fertility is, the journey of trying to navigate infertility, if that's something you're trying to overcome, is not a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon. And so the biggest takeaway is don't be like I was. Don't overestimate your ability to handle the mental health hurdles that can come along with this journey. So much of the success that I see in my patients has stemmed from their resilience and their ability to stick with their goal until they realize a successful outcome. And it takes grit, determination, and it takes being resilient. And that's not something that just comes to people naturally. This is something that we have to work on. And part of that is prioritizing your mental health and making sure that you're arming yourself with the knowledge and the support, whether that looks like having a therapist or whether that looks like really communicating with your partner, if you're partnered, and being intentional and not just assuming they're always going to know what you need. And, communicating with your friends and family members to say, hey, this is how you can show up for me. I hope this resource is something that friends and family members of those going through infertility will read to better educate themselves on how to show up. And instead of putting the burden or the onus on the person going through their own challenge, to educate them and those around themselves, I think it's important for people to form a community around those with infertility. And I think conversations like that help raise awareness. It's not just about helping the people going through the challenge, but also creating networks around them of support and ensuring that everyone's on the same page of what's actually helpful and how they can best show up.
And Dr. Lucky, what has been the biggest life lesson you've learned so far?
I've learned so many in the process of helping individuals and couples navigate infertility. I think the biggest life lesson, and actually part of the reason why I named my book The Lucky Egg, it's not just a fun play on my first name, which I know is unique, but I actually thought very deeply about it because I think in any aspect of our lives, we think we can just show up and if you put the work in, you're going to get the result. But fertility is not a meritocracy. There's a lot of aspects of our life that we think we can control and we can't. And I think that this can apply broadly beyond fertility. I think it's about being ready for your moment when it comes, putting your best foot forward in all the things that you can control, but also surrendering that to the universe, that there are things that you're not going to be able to control or explain, but doing your homework and showing up the best you can, but also accepting that there are things that you are not in your control and definitely aren't your fault. I think that attitude and mindset can help people overcome the most difficult of challenges.
Where's the best place where people can keep up with you, your work, and purchase your book?
So I have a website, theluckyegg.com. That's where, I have a blog and a lot of really interesting tools that I've never seen anywhere else, like an egg freezing calculator, an AMH calculator, an IVF due date calculator. There's a lot of articles that I'm constantly putting out. My book is available. You can purchase it anywhere online, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. There's a landing page on my website. There's also a landing page on the link of my bio of my Instagram at lucky.sekhon, Sekhon. That's where I share a lot of, current events and things that come up. I comment on anything fertility related, women's health related. And so you can kind of keep up with my day-to-day there. But my book comes out January 13th. It's available for pre-order now. And my goal in really sharing this with the world is I hope it makes a positive impact. It makes people feel more informed and less alone. And if you pre-order, you really help me in that mission and help amplify the book and expand its impact. So I really appreciate your support.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to include all of the links in the episode notes as well, so that anybody who wants to, check out the book, follow you on social media, you guys can easily do that by clicking below. And Dr. Lucky, if you could go back in time and offer your younger self one bit of advice specifically tailored to you and your life's journey, what would it be?
It's all going to work out. Keep following your purpose. You don't have to have a grand plan. Keep, doing the next right thing, the next right thing. And as long as you continue trying to fix the problems in front of you, it doesn't have to be solving, everything in one day, climbing the mountain in one day. It's about just trying to do good in small ways. And the sum of that will produce a life that you can be proud of, a life that you can feel you've left the world a little bit better just by being in it. And, using your talents and gifts to try to make people's journeys easier. And I think I eventually realized all of that. But I think when you're younger, you feel like there has to be this defined path to success. And you have different notions about what success means. The opening quote of my book is by Bessie Anderson. It's often attributed to Ralph Waldo Emerson. And it's about defining success in different ways, whether that be through a healthy garden, a healthy child, or a garden patch, or making, a societal condition easier for people. And I really am, that's a quote I've loved since I was in grade school, and I've always gone back to it. And I feel like it's the principle that has guided how I talk to my patients, how I treat my patients, the extra time spent outside of my day job creating content, writing this book is in that very same vein. So I think I'd tell my younger self, there's many different ways to be successful and make a difference, but just keep trying to help other people and do the right thing.
I love that. Well, Dr. Lucky, thank you so much for your time. This conversation was so interesting. It was so much fun. I feel like I learned a bunch, and I can't wait to go back and reread the book. And I want to dive in further because this is a very interesting topic and you're helping a lot of people. So I really, really appreciate your time.
I appreciate you and all your support. Thank you for inviting me for this important conversation.